My name is Eleanor Vance, I'm 67 years old. And 3 days ago my own daughter threw me out of my home with nothing but 2 suitcases and $200. Before I tell you how I ended up with her entire $33 million inheritance, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The polished mahogany desk felt cold beneath my trembling fingers. I was sitting in the office of Arthur Hayes, our family lawyer for over 30 years. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and paper, a scent that usually comforted me but now felt like it was suffocating me. For 3 days I hadn't really slept. I just existed in a fog of grief and disbelief inside a cheap motel room, the kind with thin walls and a flickering neon sign that pulsed all night long. Arthur, a kind man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many family tragedies, slid a thick document across the desk. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle, "I am so sorry for your loss. And I am even more sorry for what you've been through these past few days. I tried calling the house, but Jessica told me you were traveling. Traveling. That's what she called it." I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "This," he said, tapping the document, "is the final, notarized will of Richard Vance. The real will." My heart hammered against my ribs. He began to read, his voice steady, cutting through the silence of the room. He went through the usual legal jargon, the formal declarations, and then he reached the part that mattered. He paused, looked at me over the rim of his glasses, and read slowly, deliberately. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor Vance, I bequeath our primary residence at 125 Aspen Lane, Oak Creek, Illinois, along with 70% of my total assets, estimated at $23 million. The words hung in the air. $23 million. The house. It felt like a dream, an impossible, cruel dream, especially after the nightmare of 3 days ago. The funeral had been a blur of black suits and sorrowful whispers. I was still numb from Richard's sudden heart attack. But Jessica, my daughter, my only child, was a whirlwind of brisk efficiency. As soon as the last guest left, she stood in the middle of the living room, the one I had decorated and cared for over 43 years, and her face, which had been a perfect mask of grief all day, turned to stone. Her husband, Mark, stood just behind her, his arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. "Mom," Jessica started, her voice devoid of any warmth, "we need to talk about your living situation." I was confused. "My living situation? Jessica, this is my home." She let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound I'd never heard from her before. "Actually," she said, pulling a folded paper from her purse and slapping it down on the coffee table, "it's not. According to Dad's will, I inherit everything. The house, the investments, the entire inheritance." He knew I could handle the promotion of his legacy. I stared at the paper, the words blurring through my tears. It looked official. It had Richard's signature. How could this be? But he would never. "He knew you never understood money, Mom. You were just the wife." Her words hit me like a physical blow. 43 years of partnership, of raising her, of supporting Richard while he built his business from the ground up, all reduced to 3 words. Just the wife. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Before I knew it, she was packing my things, 2 suitcases filled with a life I no longer recognized. She walked me to the door, pressed a few crumpled bills into my hand, $200, and looked right through me. And that's when she said the words that will be burned into my memory forever. "You heard me," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Find some other place to die. You're useless now." The door clicked shut behind me, leaving me on the porch of the life I had built, a ghost in my own story. But now, sitting in Arthur's office, the sting of that memory was being washed away by a rising tide of vindication. The house was mine. The majority of the inheritance was mine. Richard hadn't abandoned me. Arthur continued reading from the real will, and what he said next made the air leave my lungs in a rush. "To my daughter, Jessica Vance Thompson," he read, "I leave the sum of $7.5 million to be held in a trust. This trust is to be released to her upon her 45th birthday, contingent upon one single, unbreakable condition." He paused, and I leaned forward, my entire body rigid with anticipation. "The release of these funds is entirely dependent," Arthur read, his voice ringing with the weight of my late husband's words, "on the kindness, respect, and dignity with which she treats her mother following my passing. Should she fail in this duty in any way, the entirety of her trust is to be immediately and irrevocably forfeited. My mind reeled. A contingency clause. Richard, my meticulous, thoughtful Richard, had seen this coming. He knew. He had put a failsafe in place to protect me from our own daughter's greed. I looked up at Arthur, my eyes wide. The pain and grief that had clouded my mind for days began to clear, replaced by something else, something cold and sharp and utterly focused. I took a deep, shaky breath, the first real breath I'd taken in days, and opened my mouth. The entirety of her trust is to be immediately and irrevocably forfeited, and all funds redirected to my wife, Eleanor. My breath hitched. The words echoed in the silent office. Not only did Jessica lose her inheritance, but it now belonged to me. The total wasn't just the $23 million I was left, it was the full $33 million. Richard hadn't just protected me, he had armed me. Looking back now, I can see how meticulously Jessica and Mark had laid their trap in the weeks following Richard's funeral. It wasn't a sudden, impulsive act of cruelty. It was a calculated campaign. It was gaslighting, pure and simple. It started subtly. A week after Richard was gone, they insisted on a family dinner to check on me. We sat at the dining table, Richard's empty chair feeling like a black hole at the end of the table. "Mom, you seem a little scattered," Jessica said, her voice dripping with false concern as I momentarily forgot where I'd put the salt shaker. "It's understandable, of course. The grief." Mark chimed in, placing his hand over mine. His touch felt clammy. "We're just worried, Eleanor. This is a big house. A lot to manage on your own. Yesterday you couldn't find your car keys, remember? I had found them, of course, right in my purse where they always were." But he said it with such conviction that for a second I doubted myself. That was their technique. They planted tiny seeds of doubt, watering them daily with feigned worry. A few days later, they called what they termed a family meeting. They sat me down on my own living room sofa as if I were a child about to be lectured. "Mom, we've been doing some research," Mark said, pulling a stack of glossy brochures from his briefcase. He fanned them out on the coffee table. They were for places with names like Golden Meadows and Serenity Gardens. High-end retirement communities. "These places are wonderful," Jessica cooed, picking one up. "They have activities, nursing staff on site, no responsibilities. You'd have friends your own age. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." What they meant was we wouldn't have to worry about you. We wouldn't have to wait for our inheritance. The next week, the cruelty became more refined. I came into the kitchen one morning to find a magazine left open on the counter. It was an article about the early signs of dementia in the elderly. Several lines were highlighted with a yellow marker. Lines about memory loss, confusion, and difficulty managing daily tasks. I felt a cold dread creep over me. They wanted me to think I was losing my mind. They wanted me to be so scared and confused that I would gratefully hand over my life, my home, to them. They were trying to break me down piece by piece so they could sweep up the remains. The worst part? It was starting to work. I found myself second-guessing everything. Did I lock the door? Did I turn off the stove? I started writing notes to myself, little reminders stuck all over the house, a testament to the chaos they had sown in my mind. I felt myself shrinking, becoming the frail, confused old woman they wanted me to be. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, haunting the hallways of a life I was being told I could no longer manage. They were so good, so convincing in their roles as the concerned children, that I started to wonder if they were right. Maybe I was a burden. Maybe I was incapable. Maybe this house filled with 43 years of memories was too much for me now. And that's exactly where they needed me to be, teetering on the edge of surrender. And then on that final fateful night, after weeks of this psychological torture, Jessica decided it was time to push me off the cliff. She walked in, her face set in a grim, determined mask, and pulled out that single folded piece of paper. That piece of paper was the weapon she'd been sharpening for weeks. It was a forgery, a sophisticated one, but a lie nonetheless. She laid it on the table between us, a declaration of war disguised as a legal document. "This is Dad's final will, Mom," she said, her voice flat. "I had the lawyer read it to me this morning. He left everything to me." I picked it up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read the text. It looked real. The letterhead, the legal phrases, the signature at the bottom that looked so much like Richard's. It detailed how the house, the investments, the accounts, everything was now hers. Why? I whispered, the word catching in my throat. Why would he do this? Jessica's mask of false concern finally dropped, revealing the cold, hard contempt beneath. Because he knew I would manage his legacy better than you could, she said, the words like chips of ice. You never understood the salary he made, the funds he managed. Let's be honest, Mom. You never had to deal with any of it. You were just the wife. Just the wife. That phrase echoed in the cavernous space where my heart used to be. 43 years of packing lunches, nursing fevers, hosting holidays, supporting his dreams, raising her. All of it dismissed. I was not a partner. I was an accessory. The rest was a blur of motion. She was suddenly packing my things, pulling my clothes from the closet with an impatient roughness. She moved with a chilling purpose, like she was cleaning out a room for a new tenant, not evicting her own mother. Mark hovered in the background, a silent, spineless accomplice, refusing to meet my gaze. He was the one who carried my 2 suitcases to the door, the sum total of my life packed into cheap luggage. Jessica walked me onto the porch, the same porch where we'd taken her prom pictures, where Richard and I used to sit on summer evenings. She pressed the $200 into my palm. It wasn't an act of kindness, it was a final insult. A tip for services rendered. Then came the final brutal blow. Find some other place to die. You're useless now. The click of the lock behind me was the sound of my world ending. I ended up calling a cheap taxi, the only thing I could think to do. As I sat in the back of the musty car watching my home, disappear into the rainy night, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica. My thumb trembled as I opened it. It read, FYI. I heard the Maple Street residence is very affordable. I'm sure they have vacancies. My blood ran cold. The Maple Street residence. It wasn't a residence. It was a state-funded nursing home. A place for the destitute, the forgotten. My daughter, who believed she was about to inherit over $30 million, was suggesting I live out my final years in a place known for its neglect. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it was what finally broke through my shock. I spent the next 2 days in a room at the Sunset Motor Inn. The carpet was stained, the television buzzed, and I could hear the couple next door arguing through the paper-thin walls. I sat on the lumpy mattress and stared at the wall, replaying every moment, every word. I could have given up. I could have crawled into that bed and waited for the end just like she told me to. But in the quiet hum of the motel's vending machine, something else began to stir. A memory. It was small, seemingly insignificant. Richard, about a year ago, sitting at his desk laughing. He was on the phone with Arthur Hayes. No, Arthur, he'd said. Make sure Eleanor's signature is nowhere near the business account transfers. I want her protected, not liable. He was always protecting me from the complexities of the finances. Why then would he suddenly throw me to the wolves in his will? It didn't make sense. And that tiny inconsistency, that one memory that didn't fit Jessica's narrative, was enough. It was a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. It was the reason I picked up the motel phone and called Arthur Hayes' office. It was the reason I was going to fight. Back in Arthur's office, the weight of the last few days began to lift as the truth settled around me. Richard hadn't abandoned me. He had anticipated this. He had outmaneuvered our daughter from beyond the grave. Because she violated that clause so egregiously, Eleanor, Arthur explained, his voice a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. The trust is void. The $7.5 million that would have been hers now defaults to you, as stipulated. The entire estate. All $33 million, the house, its contents. It's all yours. Unconditionally. I felt a dizzying wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't about the money. It was the validation. It was knowing that the man I had loved and built a life with had seen me, valued me, and protected me until the very end. There's more, Arthur said softly. He stood up and walked over to a large steel safe in the corner of his office. He spun the dial, the clicks echoing in the quiet room, and pulled out a heavy metal safe deposit box. He placed it on the desk in front of me. Richard left this with me 6 months ago, he said. His instructions were very specific. It was only to be opened by you alone, in the event of his death, especially if there were any disputes regarding the inheritance. My fingers trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was the thick, officially bound copy of the real will. And lying on top of it was a single cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax. My name was written on the front in Richard's familiar, elegant script. I broke the seal. The letter inside was several pages long, every line filled with his handwriting. My dearest Eleanor, it began. If you are reading this, it means my worst fears have come true. It means our daughter has let her greed and her sense of entitlement overshadow whatever love she ever had for you. And for that, my love, I am eternally sorry. I am sorry for my part in spoiling her, for perhaps not seeing the coldness in her heart sooner. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the words. I blinked them away and kept reading. For months, I have watched her. I have seen the way she dismisses you, the way Mark looks at our home not as a place of family, but as an asset. I've heard the whispers about your forgetfulness, the subtle suggestions that you are becoming a burden. It broke my heart, Eleanor. You have never been a burden. You have been the bedrock of my entire life. You sacrificed your own ambitions to raise our family. You managed our home with a grace and strength I could never muster. You held me together when my business nearly failed. You were never just the wife. You were my partner, my equal, my everything. I am changing the will to reflect that truth. This letter is my testimony. I fear Jessica will try to contest the will, to paint you as incompetent. She will lie. This letter, and the contingency clause I've instructed Arthur to add, are my final defense of you. She will discover that kindness has a value far greater than any dollar amount, and cruelty has a price she cannot afford to pay. He ended the letter with a final, heartbreaking line. Live well, my love. Live freely. Build the life you put on hold for me. You have earned it 1,000 times over. I folded the letter, holding it to my chest. It was a final gift from him, a validation that washed away the poison of Jessica's words. The grief for my husband was still there, a deep, aching void. But now it was mingled with a fierce, burning gratitude. He had given me more than an inheritance. He had given me back my self-worth. He had given me the strength to face what was coming. The game wasn't over. Jessica had made her move. Now it was my turn. I looked up at Arthur, the tears on my cheeks now dry, my eyes clear and hard. So, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. What's our next move? Arthur leaned back in his chair, a small grim smile playing on his lips. Our next move, Eleanor, is to turn on the lights and watch the cockroaches scatter. The plan was simple and swift. While I sat in his office, sipping a cup of tea that actually tasted like something other than despair, Arthur became a whirlwind of quiet, lethal efficiency. His first call was to the fraud department of the bank that held Richard's estate accounts. He explained the situation, faxed over a copy of the real will, and the forged document Jessica had used. The bank, faced with clear evidence of felony fraud, immediately put a freeze on every single asset. Any credit cards linked to the estate were canceled. Any transfers Jessica had initiated were stopped dead in their tracks. His second call was to the Oak Creek Police Department, to a detective he knew personally. He laid out the case: elder abuse, financial fraud, illegal eviction. The detective listened, asked a few pointed questions, and promised to look into it immediately. It will take them a day or two to get a warrant, Arthur said after he hung up. But in the meantime, Jessica's financial world is about to come to a screeching halt. We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3:47 p.m., my phone, which had been silent for 3 days, buzzed to life. The screen lit up with a single word: Jessica. I took a deep breath, looked at Arthur, and he nodded. I answered, putting the call on speaker. Mom? Where are you? Her voice was tight, strained. The fake sympathy was gone, replaced by a raw, frantic edge. Something's wrong with the bank accounts. They're saying Dad's assets are frozen. There must be some kind of mistake. I let the silence hang for a moment before I spoke, keeping my own voice calm, almost placid. Hello, Jessica. No, there's no mistake. What do you mean there's no mistake? I was trying to pay for catering for a dinner party and my card was declined. It's humiliating. I'm at Arthur Hayes's office, I said simply. You remember him, don't you? Dad's lawyer. The one who read the real will. Another pause, this one heavy with dawning horror. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. The desperate search for an explanation, an escape route. "Mom," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen to me. You're grieving. You're confused. Arthur is an old man. He's probably gotten the paperwork mixed up. Someone is taking advantage of your emotional state. Let me handle this." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Even now, cornered and exposed, her first instinct was to gaslight me again. "My emotional state is perfectly clear, dear," I replied, the word dear feeling like a sharp stone in my mouth. "I've discovered you're a liar and a thief. I've also discovered that your father was a much smarter man than either of us gave him credit for." "I don't know what you're talking about. I was protecting you. You can't manage that kind of money," she shrieked, the panic finally breaking through. "And I suppose you were also protecting me when you told me to find another place to die?" I asked softly. The silence on the other end was absolute. I had her. She knew I had her. "Let me make this very simple for you, Jessica," I continued, my voice cold as steel. "Not only did you never inherit everything, but your actual inheritance, the $7.5 million your father so generously left you, is also gone. It's mine now, thanks to that lovely little clause about treating me with dignity and respect. It turns out, throwing your grieving mother out of her house doesn't qualify." I could hear a choked, strangled sound, half sob, half gasp. After a long moment, her voice came back, small and pleading. "Mama, please. Can we just meet? We can talk this out. I'm sure we can come to an agreement." "Oh, we'll be seeing each other soon," I said, the finality of it chilling even myself. "In court." I ended the call and placed the phone gently on the desk. A sense of profound righteous power flowed through me. I had faced the monster, and I had won. But as I sat there, basking in the first real moment of victory, I had no idea that the fight was far from over. I had no idea that the enemy had more than one face. I spent that night back in my own bed for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The familiar scent of my lavender linen spray, the comfortable weight of my quilt. It was a homecoming that felt more like a resurrection. The next morning, Arthur called with news. The police, armed with bank records and a sworn statement from me, had arrested Jessica and Mark the previous evening. They had found them at Lucille, the most expensive restaurant in town, toasting their new inheritance with champagne. The image was so perfectly, disgustingly cliché that I almost laughed. For a day, I allowed myself to breathe. I walked through my house, touching my belongings, reclaiming my space. I threw out the pretentious, modern art prints Jessica had already brought in, and put my familiar landscapes back on the walls. It felt like I was slowly, carefully, piecing my life back together. I was naive to think it would be that easy. The following morning, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peered through the peephole and saw a woman I didn't recognize standing on my porch. She was in her late 60s, immaculately dressed in a Chanel suit, her silver hair styled in a perfect, unmoving coif. She carried an air of effortless wealth and absolute authority. I opened the door. "Can I help you?" "Eleanor Vance?" she asked, her voice crisp and cool. She didn't wait for an answer. "I am Catherine Thompson, Mark's mother." My stomach tightened. I said nothing, just held the door, barring her way. She gave a thin, dismissive smile. "May I come in? I believe we have something to discuss regarding our children's unfortunate misunderstanding." Reluctantly, I stepped aside. She swept into my foyer, her eyes scanning my home with a critical, appraising glance, as if she were inspecting a property she was considering buying and demolishing. She settled herself on my sofa without being invited, placing her crocodile leather handbag beside her. "Mrs. Vance," she began, getting straight to the point, "my son has made a regrettable error in judgment." He was, of course, merely following his wife's lead. He's a good boy, but easily influenced by a strong personality. She was already trying to pin the entire thing on Jessica, to paint her son as an innocent victim. I felt a hot flash of anger crawl up my neck. "Your good boy helped throw me out of my own home and stood by while his wife forged legal documents," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "That's not an error in judgment, Mrs. Thompson. That's a felony." Her polished facade didn't crack. Be that as it may, she continued smoothly, I am here to propose a more civilized solution. Pursuing criminal charges is so terribly messy. It damages reputations, futures. Think of the grandchildren. Jessica and Mark should have thought of the grandchildren before they committed fraud. I shot back. That's when her tone changed. The pretense of civility vanished, replaced by a blade of pure steel. Let me be very clear, Eleanor. You can drop these charges. My family is prepared to offer a generous settlement for your troubles, of course. We can make this all go away. It's not for sale. Catherine's eyes narrowed. I think you'll find that it is, she said softly. You see, we've had our lawyers look into your late husband's affairs. Richard was a very clever businessman. It would be a terrible shame if certain details about his financial practices were to become public during the trial. A man's legacy is a fragile thing. It would be a pity to see his good name dragged through the mud, wouldn't it? The threat was unmistakable. It wasn't a bribe. It was blackmail. My blood ran cold. Richard. My Richard, the most honest, upstanding man I had ever known? It was impossible. It was a bluff. A desperate tactic from a rich woman trying to protect her criminal son. It had to be. I think you should leave, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. Think about it, Eleanor, she said, her voice once again light and conversational. A quiet life, a comfortable bank account, and Richard's precious reputation intact. Or a public ugly trial that could destroy everything he built. The choice is yours. She walked out, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. I stood frozen in my living room, her words echoing in my ears. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But the seed of fear she had planted was already taking root. What if it wasn't? What secrets could my husband have possibly kept from me? I realized with a jolt of terror that this wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. This was about Richard's entire life. And I had to find out the truth before Catherine Thompson used it to bury me. Catherine's threat haunted me. For 2 days I barely slept, her words replaying in my mind. Richard's legacy. His good name. Was it possible that the man I had shared a bed with for 43 years had a life I knew nothing about? The thought was a betrayal almost as sharp as Jessica's. I couldn't let it go. I had to know. I called Arthur, but he advised caution. It's likely a bluff, Eleanor. A classic intimidation tactic. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I knew I couldn't rely on just lawyers. I needed someone who could dig deeper, someone who operated in the gray areas. Arthur reluctantly gave me a name. Maria Chan, a private financial investigator. He said she was the best, discreet and relentless. Maria arrived the next day. She was a woman in her 40s, sharp, no-nonsense, with eyes that seemed to see right through you. She didn't look like a private eye from the movies, she looked like a forensic accountant, which I suppose is what she was. I led her to Richard's home office, a room I had always kept meticulously clean but had rarely entered when he was alive. It was his sanctuary. Where do we start? I asked, feeling like a trespasser. We start with everything, Maria said, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Bank statements, tax returns, incorporation documents, old ledgers. Anything and everything. For the next 6 hours we worked in silence. The office, once a place of quiet order, was soon covered in stacks of paper. Maria moved with a methodical intensity, her eyes scanning documents with a speed I could barely follow. At first everything seemed normal. Decades of a successful consulting business, all laid out in neat columns and figures. But then about 4 hours in, Maria stopped. She was holding a ledger from about 12 years ago. This is odd, she murmured, more to herself than to me. What is it? I asked, my heart starting to pound. These are consulting fees, she said, pointing to a series of entries. Large ones. Paid out to a holding company. Apex Global Solutions. I've never heard of it, I said. Neither have I, Maria said, already typing the name into her laptop. And according to the State Business Registry, it doesn't exist. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Fictitious companies. That was just the beginning. As we dug deeper, the pristine facade of Richard's business began to crumble. We found more shell corporations. We found invoices for services that were never rendered. We found a pattern of huge, inexplicable cash transfers moving through a web of offshore accounts. It was a sophisticated, complex system designed to do one thing: hide the origin of money. By midnight, the evidence was overwhelming, laid out across Richard's polished oak desk like the wreckage of a plane crash. Maria finally sat back, her face grim. She took a deep breath before she delivered the verdict that would shatter my world for the second time in a week. "Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I'm so sorry, but there's no other explanation for this. Your husband was running a money laundering operation. A very large, very successful one." The room started to spin. "No," I whispered. "No, that's impossible. Richard was the most honest man I knew. He gave to charity. He was on the church council. The best criminals often are," Maria said gently. "This level of activity, the connections needed to move this much money. He wasn't working alone. Based on some of these transaction codes, my guess is he was washing money for the Costello crime family out of Chicago." The name hit me like a physical blow. The Costellos. Even I had heard of them. They were notorious, ruthless gangsters. My Richard, my gentle, kind Richard, had been in business with mobsters. Every memory I had of our life together suddenly felt tainted, like a beautiful photograph that had been burned at the edges. The lavish vacations, Jessica's expensive college fund, the very house I was standing in. Was it all paid for with dirty money? Was our entire life a lie funded by crime? I sank into Richard's leather chair, the one he had been so proud of, and felt a wave of nausea. The $33 million inheritance wasn't a legacy. It was evidence. It was the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. And I, his loving wife, was now in possession of it. I was implicated. As if on cue, my phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the stunned silence of the office. It was a blocked number. I knew somehow who it was. I answered, my hand shaking. A tinny, collect call voice announced, "You have a call from an inmate at the Cook County Correctional Facility. Do you accept the charges?" I whispered, "Yes." There was a click, and then my daughter's voice filled the line. It was no longer pleading or panicked. It was cold, confident, and dripping with triumph. "Mom," Jessica said, "I think it's time we really talked. There are some things you need to know about Dad." "I already know, Jessica," I said, my voice hollow. There was a brief, surprised silence on the other end of the line. You do. The money laundering. The Costellos. I know everything." I could almost hear the smirk in her voice when she replied, "Well, that certainly makes this conversation easier. I'm glad you're finally catching up." The arrogance was stunning. She wasn't remorseful, she was smug. She and Mark hadn't just stumbled upon this information. They had weaponized it. "Kevin's lawyers have been busy, Mom," she explained, her tone now sickeningly reasonable, as if she were discussing a business deal. "They've put together a proposal for the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's a win-win, really." My stomach churned. "A win-win for whom?" "For the family, of course," she said brightly. "Here's the deal. Mark provides the feds with all the information he's uncovered about Dad's network. He becomes a key witness against the Costello family. In exchange for his cooperation, he gets full immunity. The charges against both of us for that little misunderstanding with the inheritance are dropped." It was brilliant in its sociopathic logic. They were going to trade my dead husband's crimes for their own freedom. They would walk away scot-free, hailed as civic-minded whistleblowers, while Richard's name was destroyed forever. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That's the best part," she chirped, as if she were offering me a wonderful gift. "You get to keep the house, and the lawyers have structured a settlement for you. $3.5 million. Clean money, completely untraceable to Dad's other business. All you have to do is sign an affidavit confirming Mark's findings and agree not to speak to the press. Everyone walks away with something. You're safe, we're free, and this whole mess is over." I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. She was asking me to be complicit, to sell my husband's memory, to validate their lies, to help them profit from their own fraud by exposing his. They wanted me to sign off on a deal that would brand the man I loved as a master criminal, all so they could escape the consequences of their own greed. Can you believe the nerve? After everything they had done, after throwing me out like garbage, after trying to steal my entire life, They were now offering me a pittance to help them get away with it all. I stood at a crossroads. I could take their deal, the devil's bargain. I could secure a comfortable, quiet life and let them walk free. I know many people, faced with losing everything and the possibility of legal trouble themselves, would have taken the deal. They would have chosen the path of least resistance. But as I stood there in Richard's office, surrounded by the evidence of his secret life, something inside me shifted. The grief and fear that had been my constant companions for weeks receded, burned away by a white-hot, cleansing rage. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had mistaken my grief for incompetence. And now they were mistaking my desperation for cowardice. They were about to find out how wrong they were. "I need time to think," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "You don't have much," Jessica warned. "The meeting with the prosecutors is tomorrow morning. Kevin's lawyer needs your answer tonight." "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up the phone before she could reply. I stared at the phone in my hand. Jessica thought she had me trapped. She thought she had presented me with an impossible choice. But she had made one critical, fatal error. She assumed I was afraid of the same thing she was: losing money, losing status, public shame. She didn't understand that I had already lost everything that mattered. And when you have nothing left to lose, you become fearless. I picked up the phone again. I knew exactly who I needed to call. And it wasn't Jessica. It wasn't even Arthur. I called Maria. "I need a meeting," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Not with a lawyer. With the FBI." The next morning I found myself sitting not in a lawyer's office, but in a sterile windowless conference room in the Chicago Federal Building. Across the table sat two FBI agents. The one in charge introduced himself as Agent Miller. He was a man in his 50s, with a calm, serious demeanor and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I took a deep breath and I told them everything. I started with Jessica and Mark's fraud, the forged will, being thrown out of my home. I told them about Catherine Thompson's threat. And then, with Maria's file spread out on the table between us, I told them what we had found in Richard's office: the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the ties to the Costello crime family. I confessed that my entire inheritance, my entire life, was seemingly built on the proceeds of organized crime. I laid it all bare, expecting shock, maybe even suspicion. Instead, Agent Miller just listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When I finally finished, exhausted and emotionally drained, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply looked at the file, then looked at me. And then he smiled. It was a small, weary smile, but it was genuine. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice calm, "we've been waiting for you to call." I stared at him, confused. You have. "We've known about your husband's activities for a very long time," he said. He slid a thick binder across the table towards me. "What you and Ms. Chun uncovered is all true. Richard Vance was, for the last 12 years of his life, one of the most effective money launderers for the Costello organization." My heart sank. So it was true. All of it. "But what you don't know," Agent Miller continued, leaning forward, "is why." He opened the binder. The first page was a photograph of my Richard, younger, smiling. Clipped to it was an ID card. A federal government ID card. "12 years ago, your husband was approached by the Department of Justice," Agent Miller explained. His consulting firm had been flagged for some irregularities. He was facing serious charges. But we offered him a deal. He could cooperate or he could go to prison. Richard didn't just cooperate, Mrs. Vance. He volunteered to go undercover. The world tilted on its axis. "Undercover?" I whispered. "For 12 years, Miller confirmed. Your husband has been one of our most valuable confidential informants. He didn't just launder money for the Costellos. He meticulously documented every transaction, every meeting, every crime. He risked his life every single day to help us build a case that is about to dismantle one of the largest criminal enterprises in the country. The man you thought was a criminal, Mrs. Vance, was a hero." I couldn't process the words. My gentle, quiet Richard, a secret agent? It was impossible. It was the plot of a movie. "But the money?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The $33 million? His payment," Miller said simply. "As part of his agreement, the government allowed him to keep a percentage of the funds he laundered. It was necessary to maintain his cover, to make his lifestyle believable to the mob. The entire inheritance, every single penny, is legal, legitimate, and rightfully yours. It was his reward for 12 years of service to his country. Tears streamed down my face. Tears of shock, of relief, of a grief so profound and complicated I couldn't even name it. My husband hadn't betrayed me. He had been living a secret, terrifying life to protect our future. A future he never got to see. Your daughter and her husband, Agent Miller said, his voice hardening. They stumbled onto part of the truth. They found the crime, but they had no idea about the cooperation. They are attempting to blackmail you using information that would, in fact, exonerate your husband and cement his status as a key federal witness. The irony was staggering. The ultimate weapon they thought they held against me was actually a dud. More than a dud, it was proof of their own staggering ignorance and greed. Agent Miller closed the binder. Your daughter's lawyer called the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning to arrange a meeting. They plan to hand over their evidence tomorrow in exchange for a deal. He looked me directly in the eye. They think they are setting a trap for you, Mrs. Vance. But with your help, we'd like to use it to set a trap for them. A plan formed quickly. A piece of theater worthy of Richard's secret life. I was to go home and pretend to agree to Jessica's deal. The FBI would fit me with a covert recording device, a wire. The meeting would take place at my house where they felt most in control. My role was simple. Play the scared, defeated old woman and get them to admit to their entire scheme on tape. That evening, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I was no longer just fighting for my inheritance. I was fighting for Richard's honor. At exactly 8 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Jessica and Mark on my doorstep. They were dressed in sharp business attire, carrying briefcases, looking for all the world like a power couple closing a deal. The tiny, discreet microphone taped to my chest felt like a piece of armor. "Mom," Jessica said, her voice smooth as silk as she kissed my cheek. The gesture made my skin crawl. "I'm so glad you decided to be reasonable." They settled on the sofa, the same one Catherine Thompson had sat on just days before. Mark opened his briefcase with a flourish, pulling out a stack of documents. "All right, Eleanor," he began, "all business. As we discussed, this is a full settlement agreement. We provide our information to the feds, the charges against us are dropped, and you receive your settlement. It's all very straightforward." I feigned confusion, wringing my hands. I don't understand. How did you find all of this out about Richard? It's all such a shock." This was their moment to gloat, and they couldn't resist. "Mark is a brilliant financial analyst, Mom," Jessica said proudly. "He noticed some irregularities in Dad's old business records months ago, even before the funeral. We've been planning this for a while, to protect the family assets." Bingo, I thought. Admission of premeditation. The tiny device on my chest was capturing every word. "So," I said, letting my voice tremble, "the forged will. Was that part of the plan too?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, but Jessica waved a dismissive hand. "That was just a temporary measure, to secure the estate until we could figure out the best way to handle the legal complexities with Dad's business. We were doing it for you, really." The lies were so effortless, so practiced. "And you're sure this will work?" I asked, playing my part. "The FBI will just let you go after you tried to steal my inheritance?" Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Eleanor, they don't care about a family squabble. They want the Costellos. We're giving them a gift wrap case. In exchange, our little domestic issue disappears. It's extortion, yes, but it's legal extortion. This is how the game is played." And there it is, I thought. Extortion. The final nail in their coffin. I had everything I needed. I stood up slowly, looking from my daughter to my son-in-law, their faces alight with greedy triumph. They thought they had one. "You know," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, all trace of fear gone. "I think you've both overlooked one very small detail." They stared at me, confused. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Jessica asked, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. Just then the living room doors burst open. Agent Miller stepped in, flanked by 2 other agents, their badges displayed prominently. "Jessica Thompson, Mark Thompson," Agent Miller said, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, and attempted extortion of a federal witness. The color drained from their faces. They looked from the agents to me, their expressions a mixture of pure shock and dawning comprehension. Mark's briefcase slipped from his numb fingers, scattering the settlement papers all over my clean floor. As an agent cuffed her hands behind her back, Jessica's eyes locked on mine. They were filled not with remorse, but with a look of utter venomous betrayal. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "How could you do this to your own family?" I met her gaze without flinching. "The same way you could forge a will and steal my inheritance, dear," I said, letting a small cold smile touch my lips. "Except my way is legal." The 6 months that followed were a whirlwind. Jessica and Mark, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, including their own taped confessions, took a plea deal. They were each sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Catherine Thompson, for her part in the blackmail attempt, was charged with witness tampering and received a hefty fine and probation. She disappeared from public life, her reputation in tatters. My story, however, was just beginning. The tale of the grieving widow who outsmarted her treacherous daughter and uncovered a secret FBI operation became national news. I was no longer just Eleanor Vance, a quiet woman from a Chicago suburb. I was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fact that it's never too late to find your strength. The house, once a place of painful memories, became my sanctuary of renewal. I hired contractors, and for the first time in my life, I designed a space that was entirely mine. The dark, heavy furniture Richard had loved was replaced with light, comfortable pieces. The walls were painted in warm, cheerful colors. And Richard's office, the hub of his secret life, underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. I tore out the heavy bookcases and the imposing desk, replacing them with large windows and a skylight. It became a bright, airy art studio, a place where I could rediscover a passion I had set aside 45 years ago when I got married: painting. With $33 million, I realized I had more than just money. I had power. The power to make a difference. With Arthur's help, I established a charitable foundation. We called it the Vance Foundation for Elder Justice. Its mission was simple: to provide free legal assistance to seniors who were victims of financial abuse by their own families. We funded legal aid clinics, lobbied for stronger elder protection laws, and started a national hotline. The quiet homemaker was now a philanthropist and an advocate. One afternoon, while I was working on a new painting in my studio, a vibrant abstract filled with color and light, I received a call from a producer in Hollywood. They had read about my story and wanted to make a documentary. They wanted to share my journey with the world. We made a deal. They could have the rights, but all the profits would go directly to the foundation. My life had become bigger and more meaningful than I had ever imagined possible. I was no longer defined by my role as a wife or a mother. I was defined by my own actions, my own choices, my own strength. I was finally, at 67 years old, the main character in my own story. Then one sunny morning a letter arrived. The envelope was thin, the return address stark. A federal penitentiary. It was from Jessica. My hand trembled as I held it. For months I had pushed her out of my mind, focusing on my new life, my new purpose. But here she was, a ghost from a life I had left behind. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to throw it in the fire without reading it. But another part, a small stubborn part, was curious. I sat down in my new sun-filled kitchen, took a deep breath and opened the letter. It was filled with words of remorse, apologies, and pleas for forgiveness. She wrote that prison had changed her, that she finally understood the gravity of what she had done. She begged me to visit her. I read the letter twice, then folded it and set it on the counter. The woman I was 6 months ago, the grieving, broken Eleanor, would have cried. She would have felt a pang of motherly duty, a pull to forgive, to mend what was broken. But as I looked at the letter, I felt nothing. The wounds she had inflicted were too deep, the betrayal too absolute. I looked out the window at the garden I had planted, at the new life blooming all around me. Did this woman, this stranger in a prison cell, have any place in it? I left Jessica's letter on the counter for a week. Every morning I would see it, a white rectangle of a past I was trying to outgrow. I thought about forgiveness. I thought about what it means to be a mother. I thought about the woman I was before all this, the Eleanor who would have rushed to the prison, ready to absolve her daughter, to take on the burden of reconciliation because that's what mothers were supposed to do. But I wasn't that woman anymore. That woman was a victim. She had allowed her identity to be defined by others, by her husband, by her daughter. The new Eleanor, the one who painted with bold colors and ran a foundation and spoke to lawmakers, understood something fundamental. Some relationships are not meant to be saved. Some betrayals burn so hot they turn the very foundation of love to ash. And you cannot rebuild a house on a pile of ash. On the 8th day, I took the letter, walked to the paper shredder in my new studio, and fed it through. I watched as her words of regret were turned into meaningless strips of paper. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of liberation. I was choosing my peace over her redemption. My life was full now, but not with the family I had raised. My new family was the network of people I had built around me. It was Arthur, who had become a dear friend. It was Maria, who now consulted for my foundation. It was the other survivors I met through my work, the men and women who had stories just like mine, who understood the unique pain of being betrayed by those you love most. We were a family forged not by blood, but by shared experience and a common purpose. We protected each other. My grandchildren were another matter. They were innocent. I set up a trust for their college fund, managed by an independent trustee, ensuring they would be cared for. My relationship with them, I decided, would be on their terms, when they were old enough to understand what their parents had done, not before. I would not allow Jessica to use them as a bridge back into my life. One afternoon I stood in my studio, putting the finishing touches on a self-portrait. The woman on the canvas stared back at me. She wasn't the grieving widow from the motel room. Her eyes were clear, her expression was resolute, and there was a hint of a smile on her lips. She looked powerful. She looked free. She looked like someone who had learned that the best revenge isn't loud and destructive. It's quiet and constructive. It's not about ruining the lives of those who hurt you, but about building your own life into something so beautiful and strong, they can no longer touch it. They thought I was useless. They thought I was a fragile old woman to be discarded. But their cruelty didn't break me. It forged me into someone new. Someone they never saw coming. Someone I never knew I could be. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to share, but I believe in the power of speaking our truth. So many of us suffer in silence, made to feel ashamed by the actions of others. What I want to know is, have you ever had to completely redefine what family means to you? Let me know in the comments below. Your story matters, your voice deserves to be heard. And if you found strength in my story, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. You are not alone.